value of what you're producing, if you're in the building business, goes way, way down, and hence buildings respond the most to high interest rates by reducing employment and reductions in interest rates by increasing employment. Something similar for primary metals. Primary metal industries are the industries that make the stuff, that make the stuff, that make the stuff, that make the capital goods that businesses buy in order to produce. So you have on the order of 4 gearings there, that they're not just sensitive to the level of production, they're sensitive to the rate of change of the level of production, and even to the rate of change of the rate of change of the level of production. So by the time you slip those derivatives into there, primary metals are also very sensitive to interest rates because they affect investment flows, and primary metal industries are a principal input into the whole investment goods sector. On the other hand, we had industries like railroad transportation, which was then on a very long-term decline in the 1980s, with the rise of containerized trucking as a potential offset, and of air travel as well. They lost a bunch of jobs in the recession. They kept losing jobs in the recovery. On the countercyclical side, there's oil and gas. One other cause of recessions in the late 1970s and the early 1980s was rapidly rising oil prices. Rising oil prices will induce energy-intensive businesses to fire people, and then also induce people to go to work in oil and gas extraction as a classic countercyclical industry. If the price of oil goes to $200 a barrel this year, and if the U.S. economy enters a renewed recession, you can bet that one industry sector that is going to be doing very well will be oil and gas extraction, as we put all kinds of people to work in Colorado, in Texas, in Alberta, to work pulling out oil and gas. And then there was the ongoing financialization of the U.S. economy, the growth of the financial sector. The number of securities and commodities brokers grew during the recession and grew during the recovery as well. That's what you'd expect to see happen in a labor hoarding recession. You'd expect to see a lot of businesses lose jobs because interest rates have gone up, because the Federal Reserve has hit the economy on the head with a brick of high interest rates. But people expect interest rates will go down. When interest rates will go down again, then all of a sudden all those businesses that shrank during the recession will want to grow during the recovery. And so you want to keep your skilled and experienced workers around even through the recession so you can put them back to work when the recovery comes. By contrast, Groschen and Potter said, you really don't see that happening in the recession of the early 2000s. You see non-depository institutions, by which they largely mean mortgage lenders and investment banks, growing in the recession, growing in the recovery. You see electronic equipment, Silicon Valley, and manufacturing, falling during the recession and falling in labor during the recovery. You see financialization, securities and commodities brokers, at least that part of it, having passed the line and losing jobs in both. You don't see the kind of inverse relationship by which those businesses that lose jobs during the recession are the same businesses that gain jobs during the recovery. Instead, it's that jobs lost during a recession are lost. That manufacturers of electronic equipment, airlines and aircraft makers, well, if not for the recession, they certainly wouldn't have fired their workers as fast. But structural changes in the economy are such they're not going to rehire anybody during the recovery. So they're not going to worry about keeping their firings during the recession low because they don't want their workers to go away. Instead, they're happy to see them gone. That's what Erica and Simon said was going on in the recession of 2003. And as I see it, they have just won a large reputational bet because the pattern they saw in 2003 is here in spades in 2011. And this has implications for the type of recession and recovery we have, for what economists call V's versus L's. You see, you look at most of the pre-1990 recessions in the United States since World War II, and they really look like V's. They look like V's because you have a steep downturn in the share of people of the adult labor force at work, of the employment to population ratio, and yet when the recovery comes, you have a steep upturn as well. The recession has principally been caused by the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. Now it lowers them again, and all of a sudden, all of the pieces of the social division of labor that existed back before the recession, well, now that interest rates are low again, you want them back, and hence you naturally slot people back into the jobs they'd had before the recession came, and your rapid fall in employment is then followed by a almost equally rapid recovery in employment. Indeed, back here in 1983 to 1986, I was working on my dissertation, and I kept on thinking that there ought to be something to do about business cycle asymmetry. There ought to be a way to demonstrate that the process of destroying pieces of the division of labor through job loss due to deficient aggregate demand hurt the economy quickly on the way down, but the process of building employment back up to normal, of reknitting the social division of labor, of finding matches for all workers and efficient ways for production, that you ought to be able to demonstrate that that was a slower and more time-consuming process, and I couldn't do it, right? That the data simply weren't speaking to me at all in any productive and kind of constructive way. And so I went off and found another dissertation topic. Then come 1995, I was leaving the Treasury, and my successor was Dan Sickle, who had been a student of David Romer back when David Romer was at Princeton. And so we were talking when he came in to take over the office, and he said, yeah, I tried to do that for my dissertation too. And he was more skillful econometrically than I was, and was actually able to squeeze out some statistically significant results. But they were really quite weak. Nevertheless, what we both were saying in 1995 was that, gee, if only we'd had this most recent early 1990s recession in our data set, our results would have been much, much stronger, wouldn't they? Because in the 1990 to 1995 period, employment fell steeply during the recession, and then it just sat there for 2.5 years in the so-called jobless recovery. And for the first, say, year or so, the Clinton administration blamed the Bush administration for the jobless recovery, saying it's the failure of the Bush administration to adequately manage the economy that's created this unusual situation. Then the Clinton administration took over, and none of the buttons we pressed would produce employment gains either. So by the end of 1994, we were seriously saying, what do we do? Have we fallen into a permanent long-term problem? And right then was when the Silicon Valley showed up, and the dot-com boom started. And the dot-com boom carried along with it, to call it a Walmart, a Costco boom, a superstore boom, a big box store, a department store boom, as businesses all over America found good ways to apply computer technology to wholesale and retail distribution. And that plus healthcare spending turned out to be a powerful engine of growth for the subsequent, for the rest of the period. And we went back to normal. Then comes the 2001 recession, and once again, it's not a V, but an L, which is depressing. And then comes the day's unpleasantness, and it looks very much like we have an L, once again. Right? Here's the first half of the V, Even at the start of 2010, Barack Obama was optimistic that we'd get a second half of the V. We don't. We still have an L. It's still bouncing around way down there. Yeah?
Even with the V's and the
Yeah.
graph, they still seem to be kind of
A little bit, yeah. This was what Dan Sickle and I were hoping to make our academic reputations on. The problem is that statistically it's not quite there, right? You can say that the difference in slope is that there's a 15% chance you find that much or a larger difference in slopes for the pre-1990 period just by chance on unemployment, and unemployment's the one where things are the most asymmetrical. But after 1990, it's not even worth writing a dissertation about. It's so obvious. Demonstrating business cycle asymmetry is no longer an interesting research topic. We definitely have an L, and that's what makes me think that we need significantly more in the way of stimulative policy right now to get the economy moving again. That is, long-term real interest rates, risky interest rates for junk bond quality investments. They're, maybe 2 percentage points, 1.5 percentage points above normal levels now, which, is the deal. They're certainly not incredibly stimulative, but they're not incredibly contractionary. But if you're not expecting the division of labor to naturally knit itself together again as people go back to their old jobs, which they're not going to go back to in housing, in autos, then you'd actually want this interest rate to be substantially below normal levels in order to provide an incentive for businesses to invest. Right now, our fiscal policy, our fiscal policy is not terribly stimulative. The Recovery Act boost to the economy is now rapidly ebbing away, and it has been offset by budget cutting in practically all of the states to an extraordinary degree, another round of state budget cutting of which is about to hit. Our fiscal policy is right now contractionary, aimed at shrinking employment rather than boosting it. And these both seem to me to be profoundly unwise policy postures, given that we really don't know how to get out of an L without the government doing something else to boost aggregate demand. That is, we got out of the 1990s, when Silicon Valley and the big box stores came along, and together along with healthcare, began hiring people at an absolutely furious rate. As healthcare spending rose and as Silicon Valley began to boom, we didn't really get out of the period of sluggish unemployment in the 2000s. That putting a huge number of people to work in construction and in realty, in selling real estate helped, but still the peak of the 2005, 2006 employment to population ratios way below the peak that we saw in 2000 in terms of the fraction of American adults at work. And there's no real reason to think that this was unsustainable. There's no reason at all to think that lots of people here were taking jobs they really didn't want to take, or that inflation was on the rise, or their economy was in any sense overheated. But we don't see a Silicon Valley boom coming along, and we don't see another housing boom coming along. So the question is, what is it that's going to drive American employment growth in the future in order to pull this up? And the answer would seem to be that the government has to do something to either boost public employment, or that financial markets and the Federal Reserve have to do something to boost private investment by lowering real interest rates. And yet neither of those seems to be on the cards. Right? That we would want to have responded to this upward spike in real interest rates by doing something to offset it, and we haven't. And here, this is what leaves me these days quite puzzled. Right? Feeling that this can't really be the world that I thought I lived in, that this must be some strange alternate timeline, like the Star Trek episode where there's a mysterious transporter malfunction, and they wind up in a universe in which the Enterprise is an evil oppressive force, and Spock has a beard, rather than being his normal self. I do have a hard time until after breakfast actually saying, yeah, the unemployment rate's at 9%. Yeah, Washington is talking not about jobs, but about how to reduce the deficit and how to reduce government spending. And then I stare unproductively at the wall for a while and try to piece together exactly how we got here, especially because I do remember back in 2008 all of us saying it's important not to underreact to this forthcoming economic crisis that's coming. Yeah? Well, except that when we outsource, first of all, outsourcing produces a huge number of jobs in the transportation and the retail channel. Second, when we outsource, right, that is, when we pay someone in China or India to do work that used to be done in the United States, we pay them, they get dollars, they then have to spend those dollars. They then have to spend those dollars on something in the United States. So you'd expect the labor flows to be about equal. You'd expect there to be some countervailing flow as people in China who get hold of the dollars with which we used to buy Chinese-made commodities spend them on something. They buy a government bond, and we then use that money from that government bond in order to put someone to work in the government. They buy a private security, and the business then uses the money from that private security to boost its own domestic investment. That we'd expect the fact that we have a more globally integrated division of labor, if properly managed, to not be a significant negative to employment in the United States, that something has to be blocking the normal channels of adjustment, which would give us either a higher, larger government sector or a larger amount of investment in this country. You expect manufacturing shifts offshore. Well, then services production here should rise, and government production here should rise, and investment spending in the United States should rise. So from my perspective, that's simply a reframing of the puzzle. That market economies are supposed to be very good at figuring out how to deal with shifting comparative advantage, and yet right now it isn't. Yeah? Yeah. That's what I was saying back in 2008. Yeah. Well, it isn't causing massive inflation, right? That if it were causing massive inflation, we'd see inflation rising and we'd see wages rising. We'd see businesses bidding against each other to hire workers away from each other, rather than businesses sitting idle and saying, nah, we don't want to hire anybody else. We don't care that there are now 5 people out there for every job opening. We're not going to hire more people than we'd planned to before. So it's a matter of supply and demand, right? That certainly the money stock is much, much larger than it was 3 years ago, but the demand for money is also much, much larger than it was 3 years ago, in large part because all the people who used to hold mortgage-backed securities as their reserves and say this is our safe reserve of cash, or of cash-like asset, now say, are you kidding? A mortgage-backed security is the most risky thing imaginable. We don't want to hold those. We want to hold real cash instead. And if you go and you talk to Mark Zandi and Alan Blinder, they'll tell you that by expanding the money supply, by getting all this extra cash in the system, the Federal Reserve kept the unemployment rate at 10% and kept it from rising to 15%. But as long as that extra demand for cash is there, the fact that the government's created a bunch more of safe financial assets in the economy isn't going to be terribly inflationary. There is the unwinding problem, the exit strategy problem, of what does the Federal Reserve do in order to get rid of all those extra assets when confidence returns to normal and when people no longer want to hold this extra cash because they're no longer so scared of holding risky assets. And that's going to be an interesting and delicate operation the Federal Reserve's been planning for 3 years now. But that's where we'll be in 3 years, with a possible inflationary overhang if the Federal Reserve doesn't manage that transition swiftly. That's really not where we are right now. Yeah?
This is on the wrong track. What about the increase in the movement towards a greater hourglass economy and moving away from production-based growth towards more concentrated growth in, say, investment or, say, non-physical wealth?
I want to kick those questions to, well, two groups of people. I want to kick them to David Card on the northwest corner of the 6th floor of Evans, and to Emmanuel Saez, who's a little bit south of him along the west front. Simply because David knows an awful lot more than I do about the extent to which the failure to increase the sizes of America's public colleges and universities and keep them affordable over the past generation and a half has played in producing a two-tier economy, by which those manage to get a high-class college education do very well. Those who don't. And a lot of people who really ought to be going to college don't because it's expensive and they don't want to be 22 years old and owe $100,000 to the government that they can't discharge via bankruptcy. It was, so back in when was it done? It was the spring of 1979, and I was sitting where you were, except the person up here was Harvard's Richard Freeman, who was brought in for a guest lecture to talk to us about income distribution and income inequality. And he looked out at us, and he said, you all are here at Harvard, but it's a really lousy investment. If you'd spent the equivalent amount of time not going to Harvard, but instead simply going to work at some reasonably high-quality blue-collar job, well, you'd have had an extra 4 years' worth of earnings under your belt. You'd have gained a lot of experience. You'd have probably been promoted and eventually have reached some kind of supervisory or management track. And you'd have all the tuition that you didn't spend banked and throwing off interest. You would, except, he said, for those who, for a small proportion, be on a trajectory to having higher lifetime wealth than you do by going to a 4-year college. That was the situation that we were in back in 1980. That, yes, the people who went to college were on average richer than the people who didn't, but they would have been richer if they hadn't gone to college. Right? That parceling out the native intelligence and the social connections factors, college didn't seem to add anything to your lifetime earning potential because it subtracted a bunch at the beginning in decreased experience and in upfront costs, and the higher salaries you got thereafter didn't quite make up for that. And back then, the kind of college high school wage premium was on the order of 25% here in America. Now it's up at 80%. Now you people are making the most extraordinarily high-value investment that you could possibly make, investing in your human capital. Now it's no longer the case that you won't recoup your college costs in your working lifetime, but instead, by the time you hit 33 for all of you, you'll be richer than if you had taken all your college tuition and banked it and saved it, and also worked building some experience and some career in which experience mattered. And yet, in spite of that enormous swelling of the college high school wage premium since 1980, right now your cohort, well, those of you who are white, male, and native born, your cohort is going to college at a lower rate than mine was. Women are going to college at a much higher rate. Non-whites are going to college at a much higher rate. Non-native born are going to college at a much higher rate. But us white, native born male guys are not. And it seems the reason we're not is because the upfront price tag in college looks extremely expensive. Yeah?
How much of this gap is because of falling wages and blue-collar jobs that are finding wages?
Well, the falling blue-collar wages haven't fallen very much, if at all. What has happened is blue-collar wages haven't been growing at the steady 2% per year we expected before 1973. And here I'm out of my depth. I didn't expect to talk about this. Bob Reich has these numbers in his head. David Card has numbers in his head. Emmanuel Saez has these numbers in his head. I need at least half an hour to refresh my recollection in order to properly discourse on them. At any rate, but I was about to say doom, or at least doom for all of you who don't plan on making the most of your time at Berkeley and in making sure that your children do something equivalent. Because the big public policy implication of this recession appears to be a further cutback on the state's role in education in every single state in the United States, which means that public college is going to be much more expensive to people a generation younger than you are than it is to you. And so even though we say, what are you worrying about? You'll have the capacity to pay back all your student loans by the time you're 35 without living any worse than if you've never gone to college at all, and then after 35 it's all gravy. Even though we say that, people don't believe us and people aren't willing to take on the risk. The second part is the global overclass. Not the top 10% or the top 5% of the American income distribution, or even the top 1%, but the top 0.1% of the American income distribution, which has absolutely blasted through out into the stratosphere over the past 20 years in a way that we have not seen since the Gilded Age of industrialization and John D. Rockefeller.